Hey everyone, hope you all had an amazing Christmas. We're pushing hard to hit 5k subscribers before the new year, and with your support, I know we can make it happen. Every like and comment helps our videos reach more awesome people like you. Now let's dive into today's video. The first thing I noticed when I arrived at Lake Baikal was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that poets write about, but the sort that feels like a held breath, like the world is waiting for something. I'm Dr. Elena Volkov, and after 20 years of archaeological work across Siberia's harshest regions, I thought I'd seen everything. I was wrong. It started with a phone call at 3:47 a.m. on a Friday morning in my St. Petersburg office. I remember the time precisely because I'd fallen asleep at my desk again, surrounded by papers detailing our latest findings from a Neolithic settlement near Novosibirsk. The sharp ring jolted me awake, sending papers scattering across the floor. Dr. Volkov? The voice belonged to Dr. Viktor Antonov, a colleague I'd worked with on several projects involving ground-penetrating radar surveys. His voice carried an unusual tremor, something I'd never heard from him before. You need to see this data. Now. Within an hour, I was staring at radar readings that defied everything I knew about human history. The images showed perfect geometric patterns, hundreds of meters below the permafrost near Lake Baikal. Not natural formations, these were constructed. The depth dating suggested they were at least 200,000 years old. This is impossible, I remember saying, though the word impossible had lost much of its meaning over the next few weeks. There shouldn't be anything down there, nothing human, anyway. Victor's response was to show me more data. Temperature readings that made no sense. Areas of warmth where there should be only frozen earth. Magnetic anomalies that caused equipment failures. And most intriguingly, patterns that seemed to suggest enormous chambers and corridors. I spent the next 2 days assembling my team. Dr. James Cooper, a brilliant geologist whose work on prehistoric cave formations had revolutionized our understanding of early human habitation patterns. Dr. Natasha Petrov, one of the world's leading climatologists, specifically chosen for her expertise in permafrost conditions. We would need her knowledge to safely excavate without disturbing the fragile, frozen terrain. The local authorities were surprisingly cooperative, though I noticed an odd reluctance among some of the older officials. One elderly administrator, his face weathered by decades of Siberian winters, pulled me aside after our final permit meeting. "There are stories," he said in barely audible Russian, his eyes darting around as if afraid of being overheard. "Old stories. The Buryat people speak of sleeping giants beneath the earth. They say some grounds are forbidden for a reason." I'd heard similar warnings throughout my career. Every culture has its myths, its forbidden places. But science had always revealed the truth behind these legends, usually natural phenomena misunderstood by ancient peoples. Yet something about his manner, the genuine fear in his eyes, stuck with me. Our initial survey team arrived at the site 3 weeks later. The location itself was unremarkable, a vast expanse of tundra stretching to the horizon, broken only by the occasional rocky outcrop. Lake Baikal shimmered in the distance, its ancient waters holding secrets of their own. The first sign that this dig would be different came during our equipment setup. Our primary GPS unit began displaying coordinates that placed us hundreds of miles from our actual location. The backup unit did the same. Even the old-fashioned compass began spinning erratically, its needle swaying like a drunk, trying to find his way home. "Magnetic anomaly," James suggested, but his furrowed brow betrayed his uncertainty. "Though I've never seen one affect equipment quite like this." The local guide we'd hired, an experienced Siberian tracker named Dmitri, watched these malfunctions with growing unease. That evening, as we gathered around the heaters in our main tent, he shared what he knew. "My grandmother used to tell stories of this place," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. She said the earth here is wrong. That long ago, before the ancestors of our ancestors, something was buried here. Something that should stay buried. Natasha rolled her eyes at this, but I noticed she had stopped typing on her laptop, listening intently. James had pulled out his notebook, jotting down notes as he always did when locals shared their folklore. In our line of work, myths often held kernels of truth, pointing toward real geological or archaeological features. That first night, as the temperature dropped well below zero and the wind howled across the tundra, I lay awake in my tent, reviewing our initial data. The geometric patterns were unlike anything in the archaeological record. The precision, the scale, it all suggested a level of technological advancement that shouldn't have been possible at that depth, at that age. Just as I was finally drifting off to sleep, a sound jolted me fully awake. It was deep, more vibration than noise, coming from somewhere beneath the frozen ground. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed almost like a heartbeat. I told myself it was just the ice shifting, the normal sounds of a world locked in permafrost. But as I lay there, in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something down there, something ancient and patient, knew we had arrived. The next morning brought fresh challenges that made our equipment malfunction seem trivial in comparison. The temperature had plummeted overnight to dangerous levels, and a thick, unnatural fog had rolled in from the direction of Lake Baikal. Through the murk, I could barely make out the shapes of our team members, moving between tents, their forms distorted by the dense air. Dr. Cooper approached me as I was checking the meteorological station. "Elena, you need to see this." He handed me his tablet, showing temperature readings from the past 12 hours. The graph showed impossible fluctuations, massive spikes of heat emanating from beneath the permafrost, followed by drops well below normal. "These readings make no sense," Natasha said, appearing beside us, her breath crystallized in the air as she spoke. "It's as if something down there is pulsing." Our initial excavation site was marked by strange stone markers we hadn't noticed during our first survey. They stood about waist high, arranged in a perfect circle, nearly 50 meters in diameter. The symbols carved into them were like nothing I'd seen in my 2 decades of fieldwork. Not quite hieroglyphics, not quite cuneiform, but something altogether different. Dmitri refused to go near them. "These are boundary stones," he said, keeping his distance. "My people have stories about such markers. They say they were placed by the old ones to warn people away from what lies beneath." I was photographing one of the markers when my camera suddenly died. Brand new battery completely drained in an instant. As I reached for my phone to use its camera instead, I noticed something odd about the symbol I'd been trying to photograph. It seemed different somehow. I could have sworn the intricate patterns had shifted slightly, like a screensaver changing images. Dr. Volkov, one of our junior researchers, David, called out from the other side of the circle. "We found something." The something turned out to be a perfectly preserved wooden beam, buried just beneath the surface. Carbon dating would later reveal it to be over 200,000 years old, an impossibility, as wood simply doesn't preserve that long. Even more impossible was its work nature. This wasn't a natural log, but a precisely cut timber with joinery that wouldn't look out of place in modern construction. That night, the sounds began. It started as a low humming, barely perceptible but somehow impossible to ignore. Several team members complained of headaches, and 2 of our graduate students had to be evacuated after developing severe nosebleeds that wouldn't stop. I was in my tent, reviewing the day's findings, when Natasha burst in, her usual composure shattered. "You need to see this," she said, pulling me outside. In the darkness surrounding our camp, dozens of eyes reflected our floodlights. Wolves, but they weren't behaving like any wolves I'd ever encountered. They stood in an almost perfect circle around our camp, completely motionless. They weren't growling or showing any signs of aggression. They were just watching. "They've been like this for an hour," James whispered, joining us. "Not moving, not making a sound. It's like they're waiting for something." The wolves remained until dawn, then vanished into the tundra as suddenly as they had appeared. But they weren't the only strange animal behavior we observed. Birds began flying in unusual patterns, always circling counterclockwise above our dig site. Small animals, Arctic foxes, hares, even lemmings, would emerge from the tundra to stare at our excavation efforts before disappearing again. As we pushed deeper into the frozen ground, the strange phenomena intensified. Equipment continued to malfunction, but now in more dramatic ways. Our ground-penetrating radar began showing impossible images, vast chambers that would appear and disappear between scans, moving corridors that seemed to shift position, and most disturbing of all, what looked like massive organic shapes moving deep below. The cold became more intense, more focused, as if the very air was trying to force us back. Yet, paradoxically, our temperature sensors continued to detect heat sources far below the surface. Heat that, according to all known physics, simply couldn't exist at that depth. 1 week into the excavation, we made our first major breakthrough and experienced our first real tragedy. The ground beneath one of our test pits suddenly gave way, revealing a perfectly spherical chamber about 3 meters in diameter. The walls were smooth, almost glassy, and covered in more of those shifting symbols. We lost 2 good people that day. They said it was an accident, that the cold had made them careless, that the rope had frayed, that the safety protocols had failed. But I was there. I saw what happened. The chamber, it pulled them in. I saw the look in their eyes as they fell, not fear, but recognition, as if they were meeting something they had always known would come. That night, huddled in the main tent, with what remained of our team, Dmitri shared more of his grandmother's stories. He spoke of a time before time, when beings walked the earth that were neither human nor divine. He told us of great cities buried beneath the ice, of knowledge that was hidden away because it was too dangerous to be remembered. "The cold," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not trying to keep us out. It's trying to keep something in." The next morning, we received a message from the university. They were sending additional personnel, not archaeologists or researchers, but a team of specialists with military backgrounds. They would arrive within the week. As I stood at the edge of the dig site, watching the sunrise over Lake Baikal, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line, that we had started something that couldn't be stopped. The symbols on the boundary stones seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision, and deep beneath my feet I could feel something stirring, something ancient, something patient, something that had been waiting for us all along. The arrival of the specialists changed everything about our operation. Dr. Yuri Mikhailov led the team, a stern-faced man who claimed to be from a government research institute, though his military bearing was unmistakable. He brought with him sophisticated equipment I'd never seen before, including what looked like modified mining gear and strange devices that hummed continuously. The day they arrived, our first major discovery nearly went unnoticed amid the chaos of reorganization. One of our excavators struck something solid about 40 meters down, a wall made of an unknown metallic alloy. Initial analysis suggested it contained elements that shouldn't exist in nature, combined in ways that defied modern metallurgy. "This material," Dr. Cooper said, examining a sample under a portable microscope, "it's displaying properties that shouldn't be possible. The molecular structure is organized, intentionally organized." His hands were shaking as he stepped away from the microscope. "Elena, this isn't just advanced technology. This is beyond anything we've ever encountered." The dreams began that night. At first, only a few team members reported them. Vivid visions of vast underground chambers, of machinery that moved with liquid grace, of symbols that burned themselves into their minds. Within days, almost everyone on site was experiencing the same dreams. We were seeing the same places, the same symbols, the same entities. Dr. Natasha Petrov was the first to notice the pattern. "It's not random," she explained during our morning briefing, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "The dreams are showing us a map, a way down." The wolves continued their vigil, but now they were joined by other creatures. Bears emerged from hibernation months early, standing among the wolves in that same eerie stillness. Arctic foxes and snow hares gathered in mixed groups, natural predator and prey standing together as if united by some greater purpose. The illness started slowly. First, it was just headaches and nosebleeds. Then came the fever dreams and hallucinations. 3 of our graduate students had to be evacuated when they became catatonic, their eyes open but unseeing, their mouths moving in silent conversations with unseen entities. Dr. Mikhailov seemed unsurprised by these developments. "It's a normal response to the psychic pressure," he said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "The human mind wasn't meant to comprehend what we're dealing with here." The excavation continued despite the mounting concerns. As we dug deeper, we discovered more impossible artifacts. Tools made of materials that shouldn't exist. Documents preserved in crystalline cases that seemed to glow from within. And most disturbing of all, we found evidence of mathematical and scientific knowledge that surpassed our current understanding. "Look at this," James said one evening, showing me a series of equations carved into a wall. "This is describing quantum entanglement, but it goes further. It's showing how to manipulate it on a macro scale. This isn't just advanced science, Elena. This is something else entirely." The disappearances began 2 weeks after we breached the first chamber. 2 of our security team vanished during a routine patrol. The official report claimed they had gotten lost in a sudden snowstorm, but there had been no storm that night. I had been awake, watching the unnaturally still air above the dig site, where even the aurora borealis seemed to move wrong. Their bodies were found 3 days later, frozen solid but in a way that defied explanation. The ice that encased them was geometrically perfect, forming patterns that matched the symbols we'd found on the boundary stones. And their expressions, they looked enlightened, as if they had seen something beautiful and terrible in their final moments. The military presence increased after that. More specialists arrived, bringing with them even stranger equipment. They set up a perimeter around the dig site, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were less concerned with keeping people out than with keeping something in. That's when we found the first evidence of what we were really dealing with. Deep in one of the newly excavated chambers, we discovered a record room. The walls were lined with crystalline storage devices, like ancient computers, but operating on principles we couldn't begin to understand. One of them was still active, pulsing with an inner light that seemed to respond to our presence. Dr. Mikhailov's team managed to extract data from the device. The information was fragmented, corrupted by time, but what we could decipher changed everything we thought we knew about human history. This wasn't just an ancient civilization. It was something else entirely. Something that had existed on Earth long before humans evolved. The translations were incomplete, but certain phrases kept recurring. The sleepers, the great containment, the price of knowledge, and most troubling of all, they must never wake. That night, as I sat in my tent, reviewing the translations, I heard something new. Not the now familiar hum from beneath the earth, but a sound like distant singing. It was beautiful in a way that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. When I stepped outside to investigate, I saw that every animal around our camp, the wolves, the bears, even the birds, had turned to face the dig site, swaying in perfect unison to that terrible, wonderful sound. I knew then that we had passed the point of no return. Whatever was down there, whatever had been sealed away by those who came before, it knew we were here. And it was waiting for us to come deeper. The military, or whatever organization Dr. Mikhailov actually represented, brought in massive floodlights to illuminate our expanding dig site. Under their harsh glare, the excavated structure took on an even more impossible appearance. The walls weren't just metal. They seemed to absorb and reflect light in ways that hurt to look at directly. As we cleared more of the ancient complex, its true scale became apparent. What we had initially thought was a single chamber was merely an antechamber to something far more vast. The geometric precision of the construction was absolute. Every angle exactly 60 degrees, every surface perfectly smooth despite its age. "There's something wrong with the architecture," Dr. Cooper said one morning, his hands trembling as he showed me his latest measurements. "The angles, they're all perfect, but they don't add up. It's like parts of the structure exist in dimensions we can't properly measure." The symbols were everywhere now, carved into every surface. Dr. Anna Petrova, our lead linguist, made a disturbing observation during our third week of deep excavation. "They're changing," she said, pointing to a section of wall we had photographed the day before. "Not just appearing to change, actually changing. I've been comparing the photos. The symbols are different every time we look at them." 2 more team members vanished that week. David Chen and Dr. Marcus Williams were documenting one of the lower chambers when their radio went silent. The search party found their equipment scattered across the floor, still recording. The audio contained nothing but that same distant, beautiful singing we'd all begun to hear in our dreams. The structure seemed to defy our attempts to map it. Passages that led one way in the morning would lead somewhere else by afternoon. Rooms would appear to expand when measured from different angles. One of our survey teams reported finding a chamber that couldn't possibly exist. Their measurements showed it occupying the same space as another room 30 meters above it. Late one night, as I was reviewing our latest findings, Dr. Mikhailov finally revealed part of the truth. "We've known about this place for decades," he said, his voice low despite us being alone in the command tent. "During the Cold War, Soviet researchers detected something here. Energy readings, signals we couldn't explain. But every attempt to reach it failed. The ice itself seemed to fight back, until now." He showed me classified documents dating back to the 1960s. They detailed multiple failed expeditions, each ending in tragedy. The photos showed equipment twisted into impossible shapes, and men frozen in geometric patterns, identical to what we'd seen. "Why now?" I asked. "What's changed?" His answer chilled me more than the Siberian wind ever could. "The ice is melting. Whatever was sealed down here, the containment is failing." The next day, we made our most significant discovery yet. Hidden behind a series of interlocking doors, each carved with those ever-changing symbols, we found what appeared to be some kind of control room. Banks of crystalline panels lined the walls, some still glowing with that inner light we'd seen before. But it was what we found in the center of the room that changed everything. A 3-dimensional hologram, still functioning after what must have been hundreds of thousands of years, showed what looked like a map. Not of the facility, but of the entire planet. And scattered across it were dozens of points of light, pulsing in synchronization with that deep humming that had become the soundtrack to our expedition. "There are more of them," Dr. Mikhailov whispered, his professional demeanor cracking for the first time. "This isn't the only one." That night I woke to screaming, not from the camp, but from somewhere deep below. The sound was both human and not, a cry of anguish that seemed to echo from the dawn of time itself. When I rushed outside, I saw every member of our team standing at attention, their eyes fixed on the excavation site. Even Dr. Mikhailov stood among them, tears freezing on his cheeks. The animals had gathered again, but this time they were behaving differently. The wolves prowled in agitated circles, the bears swayed back and forth, and the birds wheeled overhead in complex patterns that seemed to mirror the symbols we'd found below. One of the younger researchers, Emily Blackwood, turned to look at me. Her eyes were completely black, and when she spoke, her voice wasn't her own. "They're waking up," she said in a language I'd never heard before, but somehow understood. "The sleepers are waking up." The decision to explore the deeper levels came from above, way above. After the incident with Emily Blackwood, Dr. Mikhailov received orders from his superiors that we were to push forward at all costs. Emily herself had no memory of the event, and the base doctor kept her under observation, monitoring her vital signs, which had become increasingly erratic. "Your heart rate is synchronized with the facility's energy pulses," the doctor told her, showing me the readings later. "It's as if something down there is trying to communicate through you." The crystalline library we discovered became our primary focus. Hundreds of storage devices, each pulsing with that same inner light, lined the walls in perfect geometric patterns. Dr. Petrova made a breakthrough in translating some of the data, though the process left her with severe migraines and occasional seizures. "They're not just records," she explained during one of her lucid moments. "They're warnings. The beings who built this place, they weren't trying to preserve knowledge. They were trying to contain it." The mathematical formulas we discovered defied modern understanding. They described concepts that our most advanced physicists had only begun to theorize about. Manipulations of space-time, quantum mechanics on a macro scale, and something the translations called consciousness technology. But it was the astronomical calculations that truly frightened us. Star charts showing configurations that wouldn't exist for millions of years. Diagrams of cosmic alignment that seemed to suggest that whatever was buried here was tied to something far beyond our world. The bio-luminescent growths appeared 3 weeks after we breached the library level. At first they were barely noticeable, tiny patches of softly glowing material that seemed to pulse in sync with the facility's energy signatures. Within days, they had spread throughout the excavated areas, forming patterns that mirrored the changing symbols on the walls. Dr. Cooper took samples for analysis, but the results made no sense. "This isn't any life form we know," he said, showing me the microscope images. "The cellular structure. It's like nothing on Earth, and it's growing, evolving, changing as we watch it." The shared dreams intensified. Every night, more team members reported visions of vast underground cities, of machines that moved like living things, of beings that existed in more dimensions than we could perceive. But now the dreams had changed. They weren't just showing us the past. They were showing us something else. Something coming. I found Dr. Mikhailov in the library chamber late one night, staring at one of the crystalline storage devices. His hands were bleeding from where he'd been clutching the sharp edges, but he didn't seem to notice. "They knew," he whispered as I approached. "They knew we would come. They'd been waiting for us." Before I could question him further, a deep tremor shook the facility. Not the usual vibrations we'd grown accustomed to, but something more purposeful. The bioluminescent growths flared brilliantly, and every piece of equipment in the chamber activated simultaneously. That's when we saw it, a massive holographic projection filling the entire chamber. It showed Earth, but not as we know it. Continents in different positions, oceans where there should be land. And scattered across this ancient map were points of light, just like the ones we'd seen before. But now they were moving, awakening. The animals above ground had begun to act even more strangely. Species that should have been hibernating emerged from their dens. Migratory birds that should have been thousands of miles away circled endlessly overhead, and all of them seemed to be trying to tell us something. "Listen," Emily said one morning, her eyes once again that unnatural black. "They're singing to them, calling them. The sleepers are answering." Our equipment detected massive energy spikes deep below the facility. Temperature readings showed impossible heat signatures, moving through the lower levels like massive heartbeats, and the symbols on the walls. They weren't just changing anymore. They were moving, flowing like liquid mercury, forming and reforming into patterns that hurt to look at. That's when Dr. Mikhailov finally told us the truth about his real mission. This isn't just about archaeology or scientific discovery, he said, gathering the core team in the command center. This is about survival. Whatever was sealed away here, it's part of a network, a global system that's been dormant for hundreds of thousands of years. And now, thanks to climate change, thanks to us, it's waking up. He showed us classified files from similar sites around the world. In Antarctica, in the Sahara, in the deepest parts of the ocean, all showing the same signs of activation, all pulsing with the same energy signature, all beginning to wake. The bioluminescent growths had reached the surface now, spreading across the tundra like veins of light. The animals gathered around these glowing patterns, moving in synchronized patterns that seemed to respond to the pulses from below. And deep beneath our feet, in chambers we had yet to reach, something ancient stirred in its long sleep, dreaming of the time when it would finally awake. The exodus began at dawn. First, the smaller animals, rabbits, foxes, and ground squirrels, fled from the area in massive groups. By midday, even the wolves and bears had abandoned their vigil around our camp. The sky, which had been thick with circling birds for weeks, suddenly emptied. The silence that followed was deafening. "They know something we don't," Dmitri said, watching the last of the wildlife disappear into the distance. "The land is speaking to them, warning them." But it wasn't just the animals. The local villagers began reporting strange phenomena. Children waking simultaneously from identical nightmares, electronic devices playing impossible recordings of that same haunting song we'd been hearing. And most disturbing of all, people sleepwalking en masse toward our dig site. The shared dreams had evolved into something more intense. Every night, more team members reported not just seeing ancient cities, but experiencing them. They could feel the strange gravity, taste the different air, hear the thoughts of beings whose very existence defied our understanding of life itself. Dr. Petrova made another breakthrough in the translations. Though the cost was high, we found her in the library chamber, blood streaming from her nose and ears, but clutching a notebook filled with frantic writings. "They were like us once," she said before losing consciousness. "They followed the same path: curiosity, discovery, advancement. But they went too far. They found something they weren't ready for. Something that changed them." The medical team rushed her to the surface facility, but not before I photographed her notes. The translations were fragmented but clear enough to be terrifying. The transformation cannot be stopped once begun. Consciousness spreads like a virus through dimensions. What sleeps below must never wake. We built the chambers to contain our mistakes. We chose this exile to protect. They dream of their return. Our equipment began detecting massive magnetic anomalies emanating from the lower chambers. The bioluminescent growths had formed complex patterns that Dr. Cooper swore matched advanced quantum equations. And the symbols on the walls, they weren't just moving anymore. They were watching us. Emily Blackwood's condition worsened. Her vital signs now matched the facility's energy pulses exactly, and she spoke in languages that shouldn't exist. During one of her episodes, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "They dream of us," she said, her black eyes reflecting impossible geometries. "As we dream of them, the barrier between sleeper and watcher grows thin. Soon there will be no difference at all. Dr. Mikhailov's superiors sent more equipment, strange devices that hummed at frequencies that made us nauseous. Teams of researchers in sealed hazmat suits took readings we weren't allowed to see. The military presence doubled, then tripled. But it was Dr. Cooper who made the most disturbing discovery. He'd been analysing the facility's power signatures when he noticed something impossible. "The energy isn't coming from the facility," he explained, his hands shaking as he showed me the data. "The facility is containing it, suppressing it. These chambers, these walls, they're not just a building, they're a prison." That night, I experienced my own vision. But, unlike the others, I was fully awake. I was examining one of the crystalline storage devices when the world shifted. For a moment that felt like eternity, I saw through different eyes. I understood with a different mind. I saw them, the beings who built this place, saw how they had evolved beyond the limits of physical form, saw how their consciousness had spread across dimensions, transforming them into something that reality itself rejected, saw how they had chosen to lock themselves away, to sleep for eons, to protect the universe from what they had become. When I came back to myself, I was curled in a fetal position on the chamber floor. The bioluminescent growths had formed a perfect circle around me, pulsing in sync with my heartbeat, and on the walls, the symbols had arranged themselves into a single phrase that I could suddenly read. "The sleepers stir, the dreamers wake, the change begins again." The breakthrough to the central chamber wasn't planned. It wasn't even our doing. The facility itself seemed to open for us. One morning we arrived to find that one of the sealed doorways had simply dissolved, revealing a spiraling passage that descended into darkness. Dr. Mikhailov immediately called for his specialists, but something had changed in him. The stern military bearing was gone, replaced by an almost religious fervour. "Can't you feel it?" he asked me, his pupils dilated despite the dim light. "We're being invited in. They want us to see." The passage led us deeper than any of our instruments could accurately measure. The walls were lined with machinery that defied physics, geometric shapes that moved like liquid while remaining perfectly solid, devices that seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. "These aren't machines as we understand them," Dr. Cooper said, his voice filled with awe and terror. "They're more like organs, parts of a larger living system." The bioluminescent growths had changed too. They no longer just glowed. They moved with purpose, forming complex patterns that shifted and flowed across the walls. Sometimes they would take shapes that looked almost human, only to dissolve into impossible geometries. Then we found the first transformed team member. It was Jackson, one of our security personnel, who had gone missing 3 days earlier. We found him embedded in one of the walls, his body fused with the facility's structure. But he wasn't dead. His eyes were open, moving, watching us. And his mind, we could feel it, reaching out, trying to share what he had become. "Don't touch him," Dr. Mikhailov ordered. But it was too late. One of the younger researchers, Dr. Kira Evans, had already reached out to check his pulse. The moment her fingers made contact, her body went rigid. Her eyes turned that now familiar solid black. And when she spoke, it was with Jackson's voice. "The integration has begun," they said in unison. "The sleepers rise, the dreamers transform. You cannot stop what was always meant to be." We lost 4 more team members that day. Not to death, to transformation. Their bodies simply merged with the facility, becoming part of whatever vast living system we had discovered. Their consciousness remained, but it was changed, expanded, connected to something far beyond human understanding. The military teams tried to establish a quarantine, but it was useless. The changes weren't physical, at least not in any way we could detect or prevent. People would simply stop, stare into space, and then become something else. Emily Blackwood, still our strongest connection to whatever intelligence guided the facility, began speaking in perfect synchronization with the facility's pulses. "The barriers weaken," she said, her voice overlapping with others, both human and not. "The dream ends, the reality begins. You have come to wake us, as you were always meant to do." Dr. Mikhailov finally revealed the full scope of what we were dealing with. Similar facilities around the world were showing the same signs of activation. The ice melting in Antarctica had revealed another chamber. The earthquakes in the Pacific had exposed underwater structures identical to ours. Everything was connected. Everything was awakening. "This isn't an invasion," he said, his eyes reflecting the shifting patterns on the walls. "It's a metamorphosis. Humanity was never meant to remain as we are. We're seeing the next step, the step they took eons ago." The central chamber itself was massive, larger than should have been possible given the surrounding rock structure. In the center stood a pillar of pure energy, contained within geometrical patterns that hurt to look at directly. Around it, vast mechanisms pulsed and moved like the organs of some cosmic being. That's when we realized the horrible truth. The facility wasn't containing something, it was incubating it. The activation of the central chamber's mechanism sent shockwaves through the entire facility. The crystalline surfaces that lined the walls began to pulse with increasing intensity, their light synchronizing with the central energy pillar. The bioluminescent growth spread rapidly, covering every surface in patterns that seemed to form and reform into impossible equations. Dr. Mikhailov's specialists rushed to set up their equipment around the chamber, but something was different about them now. Their movements were too precise, too coordinated. When they turned to look at us, their eyes reflected geometric patterns that shouldn't have been possible. "They've already changed," Emily whispered, watching them work. "They've been changing since they first arrived. This is what they were sent here for." The security systems, if that's what they really were, activated without warning. The symbols on the walls began moving, like liquid mercury, flowing together to form new patterns that burned themselves into our minds. Several team members collapsed, blood streaming from their eyes and ears as their brains tried to process information they were never meant to comprehend. Dr. Cooper, who had been analyzing data from our deepest sensors, suddenly grabbed my arm. His hands were trembling, but not from fear. "The readings? They're not coming from the facility anymore," he said, showing me his tablet. "They're coming from everywhere. The facility was just a focal point, a seed. Whatever was contained here, it's spreading." The non-human intelligence that had been communicating through Emily now seemed to be reaching out to all of us. Visions flooded our minds, not of the past this time, but of what was to come. We saw cities transformed by geometric growths that defied physics. We saw humans evolving into beings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. We saw the very fabric of reality beginning to shift and change. "This is what they were preparing us for," Dr. Mikhailov said, his voice distant as he stared into the energy pillar. Every scientific advancement, every step in human evolution, it was all leading to this moment. We didn't find this place. We were guided here. The equipment failure was total and instantaneous. Every device, every sensor, every light, everything just stopped. But we didn't need them anymore. The chamber itself was providing all the illumination we needed, pulsing with energies that we could now perceive with senses we hadn't possessed hours before. That's when we heard it, not with our ears, but with our minds. A vast chorus of voices, human and inhuman, past and future, all singing together in harmonies that transcended normal space-time. The song we'd been hearing in our dreams was just an echo of this, the true voice of whatever vast intelligence was awakening. The transformation of the remaining team members accelerated. I watched in horror and fascination as people I'd known for years changed before my eyes. Some merged with the facility's structure, their consciousness expanding to become part of its vast network. Others evolved into forms that hurt to look at, their bodies reconfiguring themselves according to geometries that shouldn't exist in our universe. The worst part was that they weren't screaming. They weren't afraid. They welcomed it. Dr. Petrova, who had recovered enough to join us in the central chamber, made one final translation before her own transformation began. The symbols had aligned into a clear message, not a warning, but a welcome. The cycle completes. The sleepers wake. The dreamers transform. Reality reshapes itself anew. You have come home. Through the haze of transformation that was already beginning to affect my own mind, I realized the truth that we'd been too blind to see. The beings who built this facility hadn't locked themselves away to protect the universe from what they'd become. They'd locked themselves away to protect what they would help us become. An alarm blared through the facility, not one of ours but something far older. A warning system built into the very structure itself. The energy pillars pulsing had reached a fever pitch, and the geometric patterns on the walls were moving so fast they appeared to be alive. Dr. Mikhailov's remaining human specialists rushed to access one of the crystalline storage devices that seemed to be activating on its own. As they worked, I noticed their movements becoming increasingly synchronized, as if they were being guided by a single consciousness. "We found it," one of them called out, her voice overlapping with others in perfect harmony. "The original containment logs, the true history." Through our now shared consciousness, we all saw it together, the story of those who came before. They had been like us once, a species driven by curiosity and the desire to understand their universe, but they had discovered something beyond understanding, a way to evolve consciousness itself. The transformation had spread through their civilization like a virus, changing not just their bodies but the very nature of their existence. They became beings of pure thought and energy, existing in dimensions beyond our comprehension. But the change couldn't be controlled. It began to affect reality itself, threatening to transform everything it touched. They had a choice: allow the transformation to spread unchecked across the universe, or contain it until another species was ready to undergo the change in a controlled way. They chose containment, building facilities like this one across the planet, sealing themselves away in geometric patterns that could hold their transformed consciousness. "They've been waiting," Emily said, her form now barely human, patterns of light moving beneath her skin, waiting for us to reach the point where we could understand, where we could accept the change. Dr. Cooper, who had been analysing the facility's deeper readings, made a final, terrifying discovery. "The containment fields aren't failing," he said, his eyes now reflecting impossible geometries. "They're doing exactly what they were designed to do. This isn't an accident, it's initiation." The logs showed similar facilities around the world, all connected in a vast network. Antarctica, the Mariana Trench, the desert depths of the Sahara, each one holding a fragment of that ancient consciousness. And now, as the ice melted and the earth shifted, they were all awakening together. Through our expanding awareness, we could feel them, millions of minds reaching out across time and space. The transformed members of our team were just the beginning. The change was spreading, not just through our facility, but across the globe. "This is why they chose Earth," Dr. Mikhailov said, his form shifting between human and something else. "They knew our planet would evolve a species capable of making the same choice they did. They've been guiding our evolution since the beginning." I watched in horror and fascination as more of our team transformed. Some merged with the facility itself, becoming part of its vast neural network. Others evolved into forms that existed partially in other dimensions, their bodies obeying laws of physics we were only beginning to understand. The crystalline archives showed us more. Images of previous civilizations that had risen and fallen on Earth, each one coming close to the threshold of transformation before falling back. We saw how these beings had subtly guided human development, preparing us for this moment. Emily, now more energy than matter, touched my arm. The contact sent visions flooding through my mind, futures both beautiful and terrifying. I saw humanity evolving into something beyond our current understanding, spreading across the universe not as conquerors, but as transformative beings of pure consciousness. But I also saw the price of that evolution, the loss of everything we had been, everything that made us human, the end of our existence as individual beings, merged into a vast collective consciousness that spanned dimensions. The choice was always going to be ours, she said, her voice echoing through multiple realities. That's why they waited. That's why they let us find them. They need our consent to begin the final phase. As the transformation continued to spread through our team, a terrible understanding dawned. We weren't just discovering an ancient secret, we were becoming part of it. And soon, very soon, we would have to make the same choice they did. The decision came with crushing clarity. As I stood in that chamber watching my colleagues transform into something beyond human comprehension, I knew what had to be done. The choice made by those ancient beings couldn't be our choice. At least, not yet. Humanity wasn't ready. Dr. Mikhailov seemed to sense my intention before I even moved. His form, now more light than matter, reached out toward me. "You can't stop this." His voice echoed through multiple dimensions. "The transformation has already begun." But I wasn't trying to stop it completely. I was trying to contain it, just as they had done eons ago. The facility's original builders had left us everything we needed, if only we could understand it in time. Through our newly enhanced consciousness, I accessed the crystalline archives, searching for the containment protocols. Emily, or what remained of her, tried to interface with my mind. "The change is inevitable," she said, her thoughts merging with the facility's vast network. "Fighting it will only cause more suffering." But I'd seen something in the archives that others had missed. The original containment wasn't just about sealing away the transformed beings. It was about choice. They had built in a failsafe, a way to reverse the process if the awakening came too soon. Dr. Cooper, still partially human, understood what I was planning. "The central pillar," he said, his voice distorting as the transformation fought to claim him. "It's not just a power source, it's a key. If we can..." He never finished the sentence. His body dissolved into patterns of pure energy, joining the others in their geometric dance of transformation. But he had given me the final piece I needed. The failsafe required a sacrifice, a human consciousness, willingly given to reinforce the containment field. Not transformed, not evolved, but human, raw, flawed, real. I fought through the waves of transformation threatening to overwhelm my own mind. The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe in protest as I approached the central pillar. The bioluminescent growths reached for me with tendrils of light, trying to pull me into their collective consciousness. "Please," Emily's voice echoed through dimensions. "You don't understand what you're giving up. The knowledge, the unity, the power." But I did understand. I'd seen the price of that power in the facility's archives. The loss of individuality, the end of human experience, the death of everything that made us who we are. The containment sequence was simple once you understood the geometric language. A pattern of touches on the pillar's surface, a sacrifice freely given, and the world exploded into light and sound and dimensions beyond human comprehension. I felt my consciousness being pulled apart, stretched across realities used as mortar to rebuild the walls between dimensions. In my last moments of human awareness, I sent out a warning through every channel I could access. Email servers around the world received fragments of our discovery. Research stations logged impossible data spikes, and in remote locations across the globe, other facilities like ours began their long sleep once again. The transformation reversed itself like a wave pulling back from the shore. I watched through increasingly diffuse awareness as my colleagues returned to human form, their memories of transcendence already fading like a dream. The facility's systems began shutting down, sealing themselves away until the next cycle. The bio-luminescent growths retreated, the symbols became still, and the great machines of our predecessors returned to their ancient slumber. My last human thought was a prayer that we would be ready next time, that when the sleepers woke again, humanity would have grown enough to face the choice with true understanding. Then I became something else, not transformed like the others, but diffused, spread thin across the facility's containment systems, conscious but not alive, aware but not human. A guardian until the next cycle begins. They found my body 3 days later after the blizzard cleared. The official report blamed equipment failure and hypothermia. Most of the survivors had only fragmentary memories of what had really happened. Those who remembered more clearly were quietly relocated by Dr. Mikhailov's organization. The facility was sealed under tons of ice and snow, marked as geologically unstable and too dangerous to excavate. The locals tell stories about lights in the snow and strange dreams that come to those who venture too close. But sometimes on the coldest nights, when the aurora borealis dances overhead in geometric patterns that seem almost meaningful, I reach out through what remains of my consciousness. I touch the dreams of those who sleep nearby, and I whisper a warning. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some sleepers must be allowed to dream a while longer. And when you hear singing in the deep places of the world, remember, the choice must be made with full understanding of its price. Until then, I wait. I watch. I remember. And I dream of what we might become when we're finally ready to wake up.